There's a beautiful narration where the Prophet talks about 7 groups of people who are shaded by the shade of God's throne on the day when there's no shade except his shade. And obviously it's a fairly lengthy narration, so because a lot of it's beyond the scope of our conversation here, I won't go into them. But one of the categories that the Prophet mentions is a person whose heart is attached to the mosque. And I think that's really beautiful and important to highlight, that here you have the idea of the human experience and the sensibilities and sentiments that a person holds toward a place of prayer. I think it's important to note that the decline of Muslim attendance in the mosque is partly reflective of a human distance from religion, and that people in general are less, generally speaking, religious than they have been historically. The Muslims are not, unfortunately, safe from that. There is a general decline in healthy spirituality and religiosity globally. I think that's a fair argument. I don't think that, that's a far shot. So then you've got the reality of how Islam is experienced in America. I think one of the problems, challenges of the masjid is the idea of the ethnic mosque. How often do you go to a place and say, oh, tell me about the masajid in the city? People say, oh, well, there's a Pakistani mosque over here. There's the Arab mosque over here, maybe an Afghani mosque here, or a Fijian mosque. So as America becomes increasingly, the lines become blurred racially and ethnically, then that presents a problem for the masajid, because you have people who've established masajid coming from very specific places with very specific cultures and bringing with them that cultural experience. And I think it's fair to say, a lot of times wanting to recreate that, call it nostalgia, call it a longing for home, call it for an affinity for the religious experience that they grew up with. So if I came from X country and I've migrated now to America or Canada or Britain, I want to kind of recreate, to the extent that I'm able, the experience of Islam in that place, to the architecture, to the smell, to the way that the Imam recites the Quran. I want to try to recreate that as best I can.
You're not saying that's an inherently bad thing?
Not only is it not inherently bad, I think it's perfectly natural. I mean, it's perfectly natural. Biladi wa anjarat alayya azizatun. My homeland, even if it was oppressive to me, is dear. I think it's unintelligent and insensitive for people to hate on people loving their homeland and loving the place that they came from. However, you've now come to this new place and there's this new experience, and your children are born here. They have different sensibilities. They identify with a completely different experience. So you've got that generation gap now, to where mom and dad, uncle and auntie, our revered elders are thinking and speaking and talking about one thing, and then the kids are like on this whole other trip, and they're not really communicating a lot of times. You also have the administrative reality that if mosques were established in the 64, 65 and forward period, then they were established by people who were mature enough to establish masajid in that period. In other words, boards were established by people who are now oftentimes in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and sometimes above. So oftentimes there are people who sat on those boards and those administrative bodies almost, as lifetime members. Well, what about the kid who's 24 now? Or the kid who's 19, let alone the kid who's 8, and whatever the future holds for them? Are we sure that the administrative bodies of these masajid are really in tune with what the kids want? I think the Prophet ﷺ invites us to just rethink all of that when he says, a person who does not revere our elders and is not merciful to our young isn't one of us. So the community that we want to have membership in, that membership is predicated on respect for your elders. Period. Like, you want to be part of this community, you have to revere your elders, you have to respect your elders, or the Prophet says, you're not one of us. But you also have to what? Be merciful to the young. So it's bi-directional. Obviously, as you get older, you start citing the first half of the hadith. But you forget that there's a second half to the hadith. But be merciful. وَلَا يَرْحَمْ صَغِيرَنَا, and is not merciful to our young. So this is beautiful, like encompassing bi-directional prophetic understanding that, like, you have to respect the elders and be merciful to the young. So how does that pertain to this idea that we had people who were the pioneers of the masajid and of the community centers? We have to respect them and revere them, period. You don't want to become a person who becomes disrespectful to the elders, who becomes mindless of their right, because it is very problematic for your own soul. But the elders also don't want to put themselves in a compromised position by just being mindless about the future and not thinking about the implications of what we're doing on our youth. And, you know, a lot of times people ask you questions of, what should we do about the youth? We should do something about the youth. It can't be an afterthought. You're talking about your future. It's not like, oh, let's just build them a little room and give them foosball and throw some pizza at them. And no, it's got to be deeper than that. You've got to invest in your future. We do have to move beyond building domes and ordaining the masajid with chandeliers. Al-ma'ani qabla al-mabani. Content must precede form. Right? In other words, we've got to be a little bit more honest as a community about the fact that we do actually have a paperwork, people work problem. That we're overemphasizing oftentimes the paperwork and not doing enough in terms of the people work, developing the leadership, developing future board members. And that's one of the ways we can begin, I think, you know, to respond to some of the challenges that we face. I believe that, you know, like when Abdul Muttalib had his camels taken by Abraha, who's coming to Mecca to wanting to destroy the Kaaba, and he came out to him and he asked for his camels back. And Abraha is thinking like, what is it? He's not going to ask about the Kaaba. So he's like, give me my camels back. He's like, what about the Kaaba? He said, I'm the Lord of the camels. In other words, these are my camels. And he said, in the Kaaba, the house, it has a Lord that will protect it. Meaning, that's Allah's. The camels are mine, the Kaaba is Allah's. Like, Allah will take care of that. So, for that reason, obviously we're optimistic because why? So the masajid, if they're built for Allah and if they're indeed for Allah, it's Allah's affair, He'll take care of them. That shouldn't lead us to be, you know, negligent of our responsibility. But, you know, yeah, absolutely. I think it's if we rise to the call, it could be a very, very bright future. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala.